This 1884 portrait of a little girl looked sweet until experts noticed what she was holding in her hand. The photograph arrived at the Atlanta Historical Preservation Society on a humid September morning, carefully wrapped in archival tissue paper, and accompanied by a brief letter. Dr. Jennifer Cole, the Society's lead conservator, had seen thousands of 19th century photographs during her career, but something about this particular portrait immediately captured her attention, even before she fully unwrapped it. The tintype showed a young African-American girl, perhaps 9 or 10 years old, dressed in what appeared to be her finest clothes, a simple but carefully pressed dark dress with a white collar, her hair neatly braided and adorned with a single ribbon. The portrait's formal composition suggested it had been an important occasion, likely representing a significant investment for a family of modest means in 1884 Georgia. What made the image unusual was the girl's expression. Unlike most formal portraits of the era where subjects maintained rigid, solemn faces due to long exposure times, this child's eyes held a spark of something Jennifer couldn't quite identify. Perhaps defiance, perhaps hope, or maybe a combination of both. Her posture was remarkably straight, her chin lifted with quiet dignity that seemed beyond her years. The letter explained that the tintype had been discovered in a church renovation in Athens, Georgia, hidden inside a wall cavity along with several other documents dating to the 1880s. The finder, a construction worker named Robert Hayes, had donated it to the Historical Society, hoping they could identify the girl and perhaps connect the portrait to living descendants. Jennifer placed the tintype under her examination lamp and began her preliminary assessment. The image was in relatively good condition despite its age, though some areas showed fading and minor corrosion typical of tintypes exposed to humidity. As she adjusted the lighting angle to better examine the surface details, she noticed something that made her lean closer. The girl was holding something in her hands, positioned carefully across her lap. At first glance, it appeared to be simply a book not unusual for formal portraits of the period, which often included props like books, flowers, or family heirlooms to add dignity and meaning to the composition. But as Jennifer examined the object more closely, she realized there was something distinctive about this particular book, something that seemed intentionally significant. She reached for her magnifying loupe, the instinct honed by years of conservation work telling her that this innocent-looking portrait might hold secrets waiting to be discovered. What she would find would lead her into a story of forbidden friendship, dangerous courage, and a bond that transcended the brutal racial barriers of post-Reconstruction Georgia. Jennifer spent the next several hours meticulously documenting the tintype, photographing it under various lighting conditions and using digital enhancement software to reveal details invisible to the naked eye. The book in the girl's hands became her primary focus. Its cover appeared to be leather, worn but carefully maintained, and there seemed to be something embossed or written on it. Using a technique called reflectance transformation imaging, which captured the surface texture through multiple light angles, Jennifer gradually revealed what had been hidden by time and the tintype's natural degradation. Letters emerged from the book's cover, faint but unmistakable once she knew to look for them. The inscription read, "To my dearest friend Clara, may these words open all the doors they tried to close. With eternal affection, E.M. 1884. The message was remarkable for several reasons. First, it confirmed the girl's name, Clara. Second, the phrasing suggested the book was a gift, given with great emotional significance. But most striking was the nature of the inscription itself, deeply personal, speaking of friendship and doors being closed, using language that hinted at obstacles and resistance. Jennifer immediately began researching. Athens, Georgia in 1884 was a city still reeling from the aftermath of the Civil War and Reconstruction. The brief period of relative racial progress following the war had given way to increasingly oppressive Jim Crow laws designed to re-establish white supremacy through legal segregation. Teaching African Americans to read and write, while no longer explicitly illegal as it had been during slavery, was still viewed with suspicion and often actively discouraged. She contacted Dr. Raymond Foster, a historian at the University of Georgia who specialized in African American history during the Reconstruction and Jim Crow eras. When she described the portrait and the inscription, his response was immediate and intense. "You need to find out who he was," Raymond said over the phone. That kind of personal inscription from 1884, "In Georgia, it's what I think it is. You're looking at evidence of something that was considered dangerous and possibly even criminal at the time. What do you mean? Jennifer asked, though she was beginning to understand. Interracial friendships, especially between children, were increasingly forbidden as Jim Crow took hold, Raymond explained. White families were under tremendous social pressure to prevent their children from forming bonds with black children. And if this EM was teaching Clara to read using this book, that would have been viewed as even more threatening by white society and educated. Black population was seen as dangerous to the social order they were trying to re-establish. Jennifer looked again at Clara's face in the photograph, at that defiant spark in her young eyes, and realized she was looking at an act of quiet rebellion frozen in silver and copper. Jennifer and Raymond began their investigation by searching through Athens city records from the 1880s. African American documentation from this period was notoriously incomplete. Many black families were excluded from official records, listed only by first names or documented only when they intersected with white legal or economic systems. Finding Clara would require patience and a bit of luck. They started with church records, knowing that African American churches were often the most reliable source of documentation for black communities. The portrait had been found in a church wall, suggesting a possible connection. Raymond had contacts at several historically black churches in Athens, and he reached out to their archivists and longtime members. Meanwhile, Jennifer examined the tintype itself for any additional clues. The photographer's mark, usually stamped or printed on the back of tintypes, was partially visible but damaged. She could make out ... KINS Studio and Athens GA. Using city business directories from the 1880s, she found 3 photography studios in Athens during that period, but only one with Kins in the name, Watkins Studio, operated by a photographer named Samuel Watkins from 1882 to 1889. This was significant. Samuel Watkins, according to an article Jennifer found in a digitized newspaper archive, had been somewhat controversial in Athens. He had photographed both white and black clients during a time when many photographers refused to serve African Americans or relegated them to separate hours and inferior service. An 1885 editorial in a local newspaper had criticized him for this practice, suggesting he was undermining proper social distinctions. If Samuel Watkins took this photograph, Raymond noted when Jennifer shared her discovery, he might have kept records. Professional photographers often maintained logbooks noting who commissioned portraits. When they were taken, payment received, basic business records. The question was whether any such records had survived. Raymond contacted the Athens Historical Society and the University of Georgia's Special Collections, while Jennifer reached out to local genealogical societies. After a week of dead ends, they received promising news. A descendant of Samuel Watkins had donated a collection of his business papers to the university in the 1960s, and those papers included several logbooks from the 1880s. Jennifer and Raymond met at the university's Special Collections Library on a rainy October morning, both feeling the anticipation that comes with potentially breaking through a historical mystery. The librarian brought out 3 leather-bound logbooks, their pages yellowed and fragile, but remarkably complete. They found the entry within an hour of searching. August 12, 1884. Portrait. Young girl, Clara. No surname given. Commissioned by family. Payment, $1.50. Collected. No surname, but a date and a confirmation. Now they had a specific time frame to work with. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. One of Raymond's contacts, an elderly woman named Dorothy Washington, who served as the unofficial historian for one of Athens's oldest black churches, called with information. Her grandmother had told stories about a girl named Clara who had worked at a white family school in the 1880s, not as a student but as a helper, cleaning classrooms and assisting with various tasks. "My grandmother said Clara was special," Dorothy explained when Jennifer and Raymond visited her home. She said Clara could read better than most adults, even though she'd never been formally educated. The church people knew about it, and they were proud but also scared for her. Reading was power, and power was dangerous for a black child in those days. Dorothy didn't know Clara's full name, but she remembered her grandmother mentioning that Clara had worked for the Ashford School, a private academy for white children. Jennifer immediately began searching for information about this school. The Ashford Academy, she discovered, had been established in 1878 by a man named Charles Ashford, a teacher who had moved to Athens from Massachusetts. The school had operated until 1891 when financial difficulties forced its closure. Charles Ashford had died in 1892, but Jennifer found records indicating he had a daughter, Emma Margaret Ashford, born in 1874. Emma Margaret, E.M., the initials matched the inscription on the book. Jennifer felt her heart race as the pieces began to connect. If Emma had been born in 1874, she would have been 10 years old in 1884, the same approximate age as Clara in the photograph. Raymond found a brief mention of Emma Ashford in a local newspaper from 1890, an announcement of her engagement to a man from Atlanta. The article described her as the accomplished daughter of the late educator Charles Ashford, and noted that she had assisted her father in his educational endeavors at the academy. She worked at her father's school, Jennifer said, excitement building in her voice. She would have been there at the same time as Clara. They would have known each other. But knowing each other and being friends were very different things, especially in 1884 Georgia. The social barriers between a white girl from an educated family and a black girl working as a helper would have been enormous, carefully maintained by strict rules of racial separation that governed every interaction. Jennifer returned to the photograph, studying Clara's face again, and then examining the book more closely under magnification. She needed to know what book Emma had given Clara because the choice of book might reveal much about the nature of their relationship. Using high-resolution digital enhancement and comparing the visible portions of the book's cover and spine with historical publishing records, Jennifer gradually identified the volume Clara held in her hands. It was a copy of Poems on Various Subjects, Religious and Moral by Phillis Wheatley, first published in 1773 but reprinted numerous times throughout the 19th century. The significance of this choice hit Jennifer immediately. Phillis Wheatley had been an enslaved woman who became the first published African-American poet, proving through her literary accomplishments the intellectual equality that slavery's defenders had denied. Her poetry had been used by abolitionists before the Civil War as evidence against the racist ideology that claimed black people were intellectually inferior. For Emma to have given this specific book to Clara in 1884 was a deliberate and powerful statement. It wasn't merely teaching a friend to read, it was affirming Clara's intellectual worth and potential through the example of another black woman who had overcome enormous obstacles to achieve literary recognition. Raymond found additional context that deepened the story. Charles Ashford, Emma's father, had been involved in Reconstruction-era educational efforts. Before establishing his private academy in Athens, he had briefly taught at a school for freed people in South Carolina. His political views, expressed in several letters Raymond discovered in university archives, marked him as a supporter of racial equality, a position that became increasingly unpopular and even dangerous in the South as Reconstruction ended and Jim Crow began. Charles Ashford was raising his daughter with values that were at odds with the society around them. Raymond explained during one of their research sessions. Emma would have grown up hearing her father talk about racial justice and the importance of education for all people. When she met Clara at the school, she probably saw not a servant but a potential equal. But acting on that belief would have required tremendous courage from both girls. Jennifer found evidence of just how dangerous such friendships had become. In 1883, just a year before the photograph was taken, Georgia had passed laws mandating separate schools for white and black children and prohibiting interracial education. Social pressure reinforced legal segregation. White families who allowed their children to form friendships with black children faced ostracism and economic retaliation. Jennifer examined the photograph again with this context in mind. The portrait hadn't been taken casually or accidentally. Someone had paid $1.50, a significant sum in 1884, to have Clara photographed holding that specific book. The photograph was documentation, a deliberate record of something important that someone wanted preserved. But who had commissioned it? And why had it ended up hidden in a church wall? The answer to one of Jennifer's questions came from Dorothy Washington, who contacted them with another crucial piece of information. While searching through her grandmother's belongings after their previous conversation, Dorothy had found a small bundle of papers wrapped in oilcloth and tucked into an old Bible. Among them was a fragment of what appeared to be a diary, written in careful, educated handwriting. The fragment was brief, just 2 pages, but it was dated September 1884, 1 month after Clara's photograph had been taken. The handwriting analysis Jennifer conducted suggested it had been written by a young person, probably female, and the content left no doubt about its significance. Mother discovered my friendship with Clara today. She was horrified, not because Clara is unkind or unworthy, but simply because of her race. Mother says I am too old now to maintain such inappropriate associations, that it reflects poorly on our family and father's school. She has forbidden me from speaking with Clara except when absolutely necessary for school business, and only in the presence of others. I am heartbroken. Clara is the truest friend I have ever known. She is intelligent, kind, and brave in ways I can barely comprehend. When I taught her to read, she learned faster than any of Father's paying students. She reads poetry with such feeling that it brings tears to my eyes. How can something so beautiful be wrong simply because society says it must be? I gave Clara the Wheatley poems last month, and we had her portrait taken holding it. I wanted there to be proof of her intelligence, of her worth, of our friendship. If we are to be separated by society's cruel rules, at least there will be this, a photograph showing Clara as she truly is. Not as a servant, but as a scholar, holding the words of another black woman who refused to be diminished by the world's prejudices. The entry ended there, the remaining pages lost to time. But this fragment confirmed everything Jennifer and Raymond had theorized and added crucial emotional context. Emma had commissioned the photograph deliberately, as an act of documentation and defiance. She had wanted proof of Clara's intellectual life, visible evidence that could contradict the racist assumptions of her society. "This is extraordinary," Raymond said, his voice tight with emotion as he read the diary fragment. "We have documentation of an interracial friendship that violated every social norm of Jim Crow Georgia, written in the words of one of the participants. Do you understand how rare this is?" Jennifer did understand. Most evidence of such relationships, and they must have existed, despite the social prohibitions, had been destroyed or lost, erased by families who wanted to avoid scandal or simply forgotten as people died and memories faded. But Emma had written it down, and somehow this fragment had survived. Now they needed to find out what happened to both girls, how their story had ended, and why Clara's photograph had been hidden in a church wall. Jennifer and Raymond divided their research efforts. Raymond focused on tracing Emma's life after 1884, while Jennifer searched for any records of Clara. The work was painstakingly slow, complicated by incomplete records and the different ways white and black lives were documented in the Jim Crow South. Raymond found that Emma had continued living in Athens until 1890, when she married James Crawford, a businessman from Atlanta. The marriage announcement described it as a respectable match, and Emma had moved to Atlanta with her husband. Raymond located census records showing the couple had 3 children between 1891 and 1897. Emma appeared in Atlanta society pages occasionally, noted for her involvement in various charitable organizations and literary clubs. What Raymond didn't find was any mention of continued contact with Clara or any involvement in racial justice work. Emma's adult life, at least as documented in public records, appeared conventional and confined within the boundaries of acceptable white Southern society. Whether this represented a genuine change in her beliefs or merely a necessary public conformity, the records didn't reveal. Jennifer's search for Clara was more difficult. African American women in the 1880s and 1890s rarely appeared in official records, unless they intersected with legal or economic systems in specific ways. Jennifer searched church records, cemetery records, city directories, and census documents, looking for any Clara who might match the girl in the photograph. She found several possibilities, but one stood out. A Clara Johnson appeared in the 1900 census in Athens, listed as a 26-year-old schoolteacher living with her mother. If this was the same Clara, she would have been born around 1874, making her approximately 10 years old in 1884, the right age for the girl in the photograph. Jennifer found more information about Clara Johnson through church archives. She had indeed been a teacher, working at a small school for black children that operated in the basement of the same church where the photograph had been found. She had taught there from 1892 until 1918, educating hundreds of children in reading, writing, and arithmetic. Several former students, interviewed in oral history projects during the 1970s, remembered her as demanding but deeply committed to ensuring her students received quality education. One interview particularly struck Jennifer. An elderly man named Robert Pierce, interviewed in 1976, recalled his teacher, Miss Clara. "She made us love books. She said books were freedom, that they couldn't take away what we knew, what we learned. She had this old book of poems she'd read to us sometimes, said it had been given to her by someone special. She treated that book like it was made of gold, the Wheatley poems. Clara had kept the book Emma gave her, had treasured it for decades, and had used it to teach her own students. The gift had continued to create ripples, touching lives far beyond that moment in 1884 when two young girls had defied society's barriers to form a friendship. The story took an unexpected turn when Jennifer received a call from a woman named Patricia Hendricks, who had read about the research project in a local newspaper article. Patricia explained that her grandmother had been one of Clara Johnson's students in the 1910s, and had inherited some of Clara's belongings after the teacher's death in 1928. "My grandmother always said Miss Clara was special," Patricia told Jennifer over the phone. "She said Miss Clara had loved someone who she couldn't be with, someone from a different world. I always thought she meant a man, a lost love. But there's a box of letters I found when my grandmother passed. I never read them carefully, they seemed private. But after reading about your research, I wonder if they might be important." Jennifer and Raymond visited Patricia's home in Athens the next day. The box contained approximately 30 letters, all written on fine stationery and dated between 1884 and 1889. They were from Emma to Clara, continuing their friendship in the only way that remained possible after Emma's mother had forbidden direct contact. The letters revealed a correspondence that had continued for 5 years, maintained secretly despite the social barriers separating the two girls. Emma wrote about her life, her reading, her frustrations with society's restrictions, and repeatedly expressed her longing to see Clara again. The letters were addressed simply to Clara with no surname, and Emma signed them only with her initials, E.M. Precautions Against Discovery. One letter from 1885 was particularly poignant. "Dearest Clara, I received word through Sarah, one of our housemaids who has been kind enough to serve as our intermediary, that you are reading the Wheatley poems to the younger children at your church. My heart soars knowing that you are sharing those beautiful words, that you are becoming the teacher I always knew you could be. I wish I could see you teach. I wish I could sit in that church basement and watch you open minds the way you open mine to seeing the world differently. Society says we cannot be friends, but they cannot stop me from caring about you or being proud of your accomplishments." Another letter from 1887 showed Emma's growing awareness of the limitations of her own position. "I am to be sent to a finishing school in Virginia next month. Mother says it is time for me to prepare for society and marriage. I feel like a bird being placed in a cage, Clara. You who work so hard for everything you achieve might not understand my complaints. I know my struggles are nothing compared to what you face every day. But I am suffocating under expectations I do not want and cannot escape. You are more free than I am in some ways, despite all the injustices you endure. You are free to pursue what matters to you, teaching, learning, growing. I must pursue only what is considered appropriate for a white woman of my class." Letters stopped abruptly in 1889. There was no explanation, no farewell letter, just silence. Raymond found the explanation in an unexpected place. A diary entry from Emma's adult years, discovered in a collection at the Atlanta History Center. Emma had apparently kept a diary intermittently throughout her life, and after her death in 1945, her daughter had donated several volumes to the historical center. In an entry from 1920, Emma had written about a visit to Athens. "I returned to Athens today for the first time in decades. So much has changed, yet so much remains familiar. I walked past Father's old school building. It houses a dry goods store now. I walked past the church where I knew Clara taught. I wanted to see her, to speak with her after all these years, to apologize for my long silence and explain why I stopped writing. The truth is that James found my letters to Clara before we married. He was furious, said I was jeopardizing our engagement with inappropriate associations. He made me promise to end all contact with Clara as a condition of our marriage. I was young and frightened and convinced myself that I had no choice. I told myself it was the practical decision, that I could do more good as a married woman with social standing than as a spinster, ostracized for maintaining a friendship society deemed unacceptable. But I have thought about Clara every day for 30 years. I have wondered about her life, her happiness, whether she ever forgave my cowardice. Today, I stood outside that church trying to find the courage to go inside and face her. but I couldn't do it. What could I possibly say? How could I explain abandoning the truest friend I ever had for the sake of social acceptability? As I stood there, a group of children came out, her students, I assume. They were laughing, carrying books, and one little girl was reading aloud from a book of poetry. I recognized it even from a distance, the Wheatley poems I gave Clara in 1884. She kept it. After everything, after my betrayal, she kept the book and continued to share it with others. I walked away before Clara could see me. I am a coward today, just as I was in 1889, but at least I know this: Clara became exactly what I always believed she could be. She is a teacher, educating young minds, passing on the gift of literacy and learning. I failed her friendship, but she did not fail herself or the potential I saw in her. That knowledge brings me both comfort and shame in equal measure. Jennifer read the entry with tears in her eyes. The story had seemed romantic in its defiance of social barriers, but reality had been more complicated and painful. Emma had abandoned their friendship under social pressure, choosing conventional security over principled resistance. And Clara, left without explanation, had continued alone, building a life dedicated to education while keeping the memory of a lost friendship in the form of a treasured book. Did they ever reconcile? Jennifer asked Raymond. I don't think so, he replied quietly. I haven't found any evidence of further contact. Emma died in 1945, Clara in 1928. If there was a reconciliation, it wasn't recorded. With the story mostly assembled, one question remained. Why had Clara's photograph been hidden in the church wall? Jennifer and Raymond returned to the church itself, examining the location where the construction worker had found the tintype. The church building had been constructed in 1886, 2 years after the photograph was taken. Renovations in 1915 had created the wall cavity where the portrait had been hidden. Dorothy Washington provided the final piece of the puzzle. Her grandmother had told her that Miss Clara had placed some precious items in the church walls during the 1915 renovation, asking the construction workers to hide them for safekeeping. She said she wanted them protected, that they were too important to risk losing. Jennifer realized that Clara had deliberately hidden the photograph, along with Emma's letters, preserving them within the walls of the church where she taught. It was an act of preservation, but also of protection, hiding evidence of a friendship that had been dangerous in 1884 and remained socially unacceptable in 1915. But why preserve something that had ended in abandonment and pain? Jennifer thought she understood. The photograph wasn't just documentation of a friendship, it was proof of Clara's intellectual life, her worth, her right to education and dignity. Emma might have failed to maintain their friendship, but she had created this image showing Clara as a scholar, holding a book that proclaimed Black intellectual achievement. That image had value beyond the personal relationship. Clara had used that validation throughout her life, had looked at that photograph and remembered that someone had once seen her not as a servant but as an equal, worthy of education and friendship. She had passed that sense of worth onto her students, teaching them that they too deserved knowledge and respect regardless of what society told them. The Atlanta Historical Preservation Society organized an exhibition featuring the photograph, the letters, and the full story Jennifer and Raymond had uncovered. Patricia Hendricks donated Clara's letters from Emma, wanting them to be preserved and shared. The exhibition drew enormous attention, sparking conversations about interracial friendship, educational access, and the complicated ways people have resisted and accommodated racial injustice throughout American history. On opening day, Jennifer stood before the enlarged photograph of Clara, studying the young girl's face once more. The defiant spark in Clara's eyes made perfect sense now. She had been holding proof of her own worth, given by a friend who believed in her potential even when society denied it. The photograph had served its purpose. For Clara, it had been a reminder and a validation during long years of teaching in a segregated world. For Emma, it had been the proof of a friendship she treasured, but ultimately abandoned. And now, more than a century later, it was evidence for the public proof that even in the darkest periods of American racial history, there were individuals who tried, however imperfectly, to see beyond the barriers society erected. Sarah noticed a group of schoolchildren studying the photograph, a mixed-race group of young friends who stood together naturally, unconsciously. Their teacher explained the story, and Jennifer watched their faces as they tried to understand a world where friendship could be forbidden based on race. "That's stupid," one child announced, and the others nodded in agreement. Jennifer smiled. Perhaps that was the photograph's ultimate purpose, not just to document the past, but to remind future generations how far society had come and how vigilant they needed to remain against the prejudices that had once torn friends apart. Clara's dignified face, holding that book of poems, would continue teaching lessons about worth, courage, and the enduring power of education to challenge injustice long after both she and Emma had gone. The photograph that had looked sweet and simple had revealed a profound story of friendship, betrayal, courage, and the complicated ways people navigate unjust systems. And Clara's determination, preserved in silver and copper for over a century, continued to inspire everyone who took the time to truly see what she was holding in her hands.